12,000 years. How is that even conceivable in our brains to think that somebody can be here for that long period of time? But since the end of the last ice age, people have been living in this area. And because that is such a vast amount of time, we have to break it up into some kind of periods where we can get our heads around it. And those periods are based largely on how people live and the types of tools and artifacts they made. So the Paleo-Indian period, those are the big game hunters. Those are the ones who are going after the mammoth and the mastodon and the giant peccary, the pigs, and the ground sloths. And we recently had a new find across the river of the Sacred tiger. So, you know, all of those things were here. They were here in abundance. We find their remains commonly. I've got mammoth tusks in my office. I dug one up in its entirety at Mockport. He was 44 feet down. So they're common finds. And that was something that attracted people. But then when the ice retreated, when the glaciers went away, the technology had to change. You couldn't go after, you know, the big game hunters had tools and spear points like this. You couldn't go after like a little rabbit, you know, something like that. There wouldn't be a rabbit left. So, you know, the environment changed, the animals changed, the technology changed with it, and we went into this very long period of time called the Archaic period, lasted 7,000 years, and this is when people were hunters and gatherers. With all of the wealth of the new plants and animals there, they would go out and collect all that they could from nature's abundance to survive. And then we went into the Woodland Period, and things started happening differently. People settled down more. They started playing with plants and doing horticulture and the beginnings of agriculture. And they built big, impressive mounds to live on or bury their dead with. And they were kind of, you know, more settled. Then, the most recent period, the Mississippi period, these were the farmers. We had full-fledged cities in this area, Native American cities, and they were the farmers, living on maize. They also hunted, but they were living on maize. And we are finding so much evidence of the Mississippi period villages here in this area. For a long time, the early professional documents would say, we don't have any Mississippi villages at the falls. We now have proved them very, very wrong. Evidence of Native American presence is all over this place. You just have to look for it. Along the riverbanks, along the creek beds, in the plowed fields, there's pottery, prehistoric pottery at the base of an arrowhead. Just all kinds of things, bones protruding from there. It's just all over. We have recently recovered evidence. Now we've just pretty much on the Kentucky side, over 1,000 archaeological sites. And we are at 1,100 in Clark County. Floyd County, we don't have quite as many documented archaeological sites, but mainly that's because Floyd County, hasn't been that well developed. There hasn't been a lot of ground disturbance. We haven't had the opportunity to find as much. And it's a lot hillier, too. So we know that there is just a lot of Native American sites. Now, some of these sites are historic period sites, so I want to caveat that. But you can look around. What are they doing? They're following the stream beds. Salt River, Lloyd's Fork, coming up the Ohio, into Pond Creek area, along Beargrass Creek, up Silver Creek, and Blue River, all of these things. You're going to find these sites. So we came, people have been interested in archaeology and the antiquities at the Falls of the Ohio for years, back to the 1800s. And it was actually in 1823 when Louisville was known to be wet, swampy ground. It was a place where people got sick, malaria was rampant, and they were trying to clear away all of that sickness. And so what they did was they took the Indian mounds in 1822 and 1823, took the Indian mounds and leveled them and destroyed them and used that dirt to fill up the low wet areas. And we lost a lot of our Native American history at that point. But we're finding evidence of it still. But it wasn't until the 1930s that anybody really started looking at archaeology in this area on a semi-professional basis. And it was a lot of intensive research, a lot of digging, but unfortunately the manuscripts from that period of time have been lost, and we don't know a lot about what was found. So then we have to fast forward ahead to the late 1960s. And that's when professional archaeology first got involved in the falls area. With Joseph Granger coming to the University of Louisville and Donald Jansen coming to Center College in Danville, and we started some very intensive archaeological research. And I joined U of L in '71, and from that point on, we've had intensive archaeology going on for the last 50 years. And so, when it came time to build the Louisville bridges, we were finding out that the bridges were going to be impacting some of these Native American sites. And so the Federal Highways Department, Transportation Cabinet incorporated monies into this project for them to mitigate the loss of Native American studies. And so we had a conference in 2017 that was funded by the Transportation Cabinet and had a series of papers and conversations about archaeology in the falls, and this book is really the direct result of that conference. And so that's how that all came to be, because of the Louisville bridges. Because a lot of those people in the 70s, and I'm guilty with them as well, did all this digging and didn't do a lot of writing. And so even though they knew a lot about it, they didn't share it with anybody, so it might as well not happen. Okay, so you remember that map showing 981 miles of the Ohio River. We don't think that book could have been written anywhere else along the Ohio River. The falls was a special area. There was a special place there. And there is a reason for that. There are a lot of reasons for that. I mentioned that not only were people here 12,000 years ago, they were here continually for 12,000 years. There are no large gaps in the record. They came and they stayed. And they stayed for particular reasons. And that is because of the rich abundance of resources and also some of the natural high-quality raw materials. And I'll tell you about that. So this is going to talk first about the environment here. And I'll open this kind of quick. There's the falls. Whoops! What did I do? Don't say God. Here you go. Yeah, I don't know. Can you fix it? Don't hit the bottom button.
Yeah.
So you see that little spot there in the middle? That's the falls area. And it's within an area called the Scottsburg Lowland. That's this dark gray area in here. Very low, and then hills here, and hills here. But we intersect here at this point at least 4 to 5 natural environmental areas. The hills, the floodplains, the wetlands, they all converge right here at the falls. And within those, there are different types of resources within all of them. So we have the floodplains here, where we can have fishing, shellfishing, all kinds of travel, whatever. That's here in abundance. We have the wetlands and all the resources that go with that. We have, again, the Wetlands, which is south of the airport, which was a very interesting spot, and it's been largely drained today, but still gets a lot of water. We have the hills and the knobs and all the rich materials that are in there. We have the caves and the rock shelters. And this rock shelter, we had evidence of artifacts going back 10,000 years. This one is out near McNeely Lake Park. Not in the park, but near it. We also have a well-developed waterway system. That was the network that combined and connected all of the Native Americans around. This was their superhighway. And so you can see, going up the Ohio River, these tributaries would go off into the inland, into the states, and on the other side of the river. Going way far into the interior, away from the river, and that was their transportation. All of that was here at the falls. And these resources are very, very unique. I mentioned earlier that we find a lot of evidence, even 12,000 years ago, of food resources that were critical for survival for these early peoples. Those early Paleo Indians were nomadic. They chased these animals up and down the waterways, and especially the Ohio River. And the stuff that we find from these periods is very deep. But it was here. And today we find a very different type of environment. The other day I never had seen a bobcat on the site until just recently. This one's down on Salt River. So I think that might be the first bobcat I've seen in person. But anyway, all types of new animals and new creatures came as the ice moved away. The water, the turtles, and all of the fish and everything was something that was certainly an attraction to the place. And importantly for this area are the shells, the mussel shells. It was really something that sustained these people for long periods of time. And if you start digging in some of the shell middens, that are the piles of all of the refuse of all the discarded shells, Sometimes they're 20 feet deep, where they would go out and have clam bakes, and they'd throw the shells, and they'd throw some of the artifacts. And you go down Highway 111 towards Caesar's Casino, you've got these shell bins that are so deep that, you know, you're just digging through nothing but shell after shell, because it's an important part of their life. And again, just the vegetation was also something that was very rich because of those different environmental zones that we had. But also we had more than the living, the organic remains. We had the rocks and minerals. In these rocky stream beds, you can find all types of raw material that they needed to make their stone tools. And it's important when you look at it because you see here at the falls, there's all kinds of church. You go up the Salt River down here, out in Spencer County, for instance, where we were recently living, they've got none. All these people right in here, India, they've got none. They have to come via probably the Salt River to this area to get this raw material to make the stone tools in which they had to live, to survive. And so that was something that made the falls very attractive as well. So again, you can just another image of the same thing. You can see right in here how close we can get to the Harrison County Church, and then some of this other very important stuff, the Multiple Church.
Say that word again, church?
Church, C-H-E-R-T, it's like a poor quality flint. So we've got two very, very important types here. That Multiple Church, which comes from the knobs, has been used extensively throughout all the years. And if you back up, you go to Caesar's Casino and you see those knobs behind that parking garage out there, full of this stuff. Go to Jefferson Memorial Forest, full of this stuff. Very, very important throughout the archaic period. That was something that they relied on heavily. And this is Wyandotte flint, or Harrison County, Indiana flint. This is said to be the best quality for making arrowheads and spear points in the country. This stuff was traded as far as the Rocky Mountains, into Ohio, into a lot of places. People came here intentionally to get a hold of that because it only occurs in certain counties, like in Harrison County, Orange County, and then in Kentucky and Meade Breckenridge. It's not got very widespread distribution, but it was critically important to the people that lived here. This was a picture of like 2,700 points that was found at Caesar Casino in one level. These are arrowheads, same type, one type of arrowhead, made out of bulldog shirt that came out of one level at Caesar's Casino. They were making these things in mass quantity. They were mass producing these things and trading them widely. Also for their own use, of course, but this was, this particular event here at Caesar's Casino, that archaeological excavation there, which took years and millions of dollars, really changed how we think about the early archaic period in this area. Okay, and this church also will occur in bedrock. You can see it in there. Look at the road cuts, you can see it. Or it can occur naturally in like nodules in the stream beds. And it looks like just chalky rock on the outside. You break that stuff open and you get this beautiful, glassy, smooth, beautiful material that is just critical for them to make their stone tools. So we had a lot of that. They were actually in Harrison County changing the landscape by digging into the ground to get some of those nodules, and you'll see the remains of these little pits and quarries within Harrison County. Okay, the other thing that we had here, and I'll move on, is the salt licks. Oh my gosh, man's lick, bullet lick, salt, a critical resource, a very important resource, traded. It was something that was necessary for life, and particularly in the Mississippi period where they would make big, massive salt production pans and facilities just to process some of the salt. And finally, the clay. If you look at this around all of the state, we've got this conglomeration right here at the falls of some of the best clays to make ceramics and pottery that the natives really needed. So we just had this convergence of all of this wonderful, wonderful resources, and it was something that was just really, really an attraction to bring people to the falls, not only to bring them here, but to keep them here. I want to tell you a little bit about the sacred places in the falls. I don't know if a lot of you remember. This was destroyed in 1953. This is out on Grade Lane, south of the airport. Well, now it's actually incorporated into the airport. But this was a natural 57-foot tall, 300-foot long hill. And you can't tell, but there are two people standing in there, I think right here. Wow. It's huge. It's a natural mountain. People lived there for thousands and thousands of years. And some of the most outstanding tools were found there. But what it is it was a very low wet area. We've got that wetwood south of the airport. That was a natural spot, a sacred spot, a place they could be up out of the water, a place that they could see forever, from miles and miles distance, and a place where they could call home and have special ceremonies. So we have a lot of these elevated places in this area that were really important to them. This is a picture I just recently found, an aerial picture. Again, the flat area, and there's that lone hill mound showing up. I think this is from a 50. Now, it can't be 52. Picture the fort was destroyed, obviously. And then the airport is right here. But when they extended the runways, they got into this area. And so now this other part of the airport.
Is that where the Louisville dump is?
Please?
The Louisville dump, is that where that is?
The dump, I still think is a little bit further south, I think. Okay. And then again, I mentioned all of these rock shelters and caves. Also had a lot of spiritual significance to the native peoples. It was openings to the underworld. It was places where they buried dead, but not in great numbers, maybe an isolated burial or two, somebody happened to die. But it was not just a place you went to shelter. It was a place that had symbolic meaning. And we have a lot of those. This is one just down the road at Clark's Point, where the George Rogers Clark cabin was recently burned. And that one is a very, very important Native American site. Very many Native American burials there. Nobody digs at this place. This is a sacred spot. Again, located on an elevation up and above the wetlands or the waters of the Ohio River. Then this is at Springs. Springs are also very symbolically charged to the Native Americans. This is one of two springs that is at the Louisville International Airport. It is now under concrete with the other, along with the other one. When I was thinking there in 1972, it was just, they would tell stories about wagons falling into this spring and nobody ever finds them again. It was continually flowing even in the driest times. It is now on the property surrounded by UPS. And there was a burial area there, 5,000-year-old burial area there, and those burials are still there. So part of the reason why the airport runways are configured the way they are is to avoid hitting the remaining burials at this site. They cracked me up one time, and I probably shouldn't say this, but they said, can you put a sign, can you make some text for a sign that we can put up there? And I said, nobody's allowed into that part of the airport. What, when you fly in and you're supposed to zoom in there, you're supposed to read real quick, or when you're taking off the other way, you might catch another word? I said, that makes no sense to put a sign there. A sign should be in the airport, though. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit just about the types of settlement. How do we know people were here besides we found the artifacts? I mean, the artifacts could mean they came in here and they hunted, and then they left. But importantly, we have found their houses. We have found the fact that they made fireplaces and lived in those rock shelters and caves. But we have also found remains of their structures. This one is a middle woodland house. It's a circular house. This is found at Caesar's Casino Project. There was a second one, and it's off picture. But anyway, when they found this is called from the Adena period. And so these were paired posts, and the walls slanted outward like this, and they had a central flue where the fire would go out. But you could see the houses. They had a number of mounds that were here. I mentioned that earlier, where they piled up earth, and a lot of times there will be a structure underneath those. There might be burials in them, but those have been largely lost. We do have one remaining still out in the Sutherland subdivision out near Prospect. There's a mound there. We have some still in Harrison County, but most of our mounds are gone. This is a picture, and everybody I think might recognize the Walking House, which was down 7th, and it's across from the Armory, the old Louisville Armory. This house was belonged to a Louisville socialite, but you can see how it's elevated from the road. This is a 12-room house that is built on one of the Native American mounds. And you can just read the stories about everything they found when they built this house, and it's amazing. And you can see here how at this level where the mound is up higher because they cut into it. So we had a lot of mounds. And then we also found, this here is in Clark County, Indiana, the The posts that make the framework for the Mississippian period houses, those were square, and they also had a central fireplace. But you can see that they would be really have a tendency of burning a lot, and so sometimes they'd get rebuilt. So here's another one where this one was lost. It got rebuilt, maybe made bigger, but they were made out of posts. But interwoven in between those wooden posts would be the river cane, which is another extremely valuable resource that we have in this area. Plenty of cane, you know, Caney Run Road and Caney Creek and all that. It was 30 foot tall, and they used it to make the walls. And then they would take a lot of clay and wet ceramics and make like a plaster over those. But when we were at Shippingport some years ago, for about 3 years, we uncovered 17 of these Mississippian houses. Now, there's a whole lot more there but it went outside our project area. But what's interesting about them is they were all aligned the same way. They were all in the same direction. And that I thought was fascinating. Back into Clark County, Indiana, where we also had some houses, you see those there, and there's those up there. They were throwing their trash kind of behind their houses. They were making like a midden, which is a trash dump, and all their garbage would be behind their house. But we were finding that they had circular villages during the late Woodland Period. So we could actually see evidence of these structures. We know they were living here. This is back at Shippingport again. I don't know how well you can see it, but can you see this dark shadow here? This actually came out like this, but we'd already dug this part. We didn't need to, you could see this is the house. You can just barely pick out some of those posts here on this picture around it. Up here is a very big trash pit. All of Mississippian houses have big trash pits with them. And almost every trash pit I dug in this area that was Mississippian had large bare feet in it, and those feet were big. And a lot of fish tails. But these, and you can just barely see, here's part of the little central fireplace that was in this one. So, these were there. Now this is something that we can see without even digging. And this is like ground penetrating radar. And there's several other types of similar equipment that we use, resistivity and conductivity and magnetometry, that will give us the same kinds of data or slightly different data. And I know you can't see this because it is zoomed too far out, but this is in Clark County. Not only did we see a bunch of houses, little square houses, and you just got to trust me on this, we could see all the way around this village a palisade. You could see the fence, the fortifications, because people at this period of time needed protection. So you could actually see that on this without ever moving a shovel full of dirt, without ever digging, you could see. And here again, we zoom in really close, one house there, there's another house here. So you can see where they are. They're about 10 to 12 foot square, and there were a lot of them. And they're still not excavated, they're still all up there, they're all protected. But it's around 11th, 12th century here in the area. Okay, so I'm going to go real quickly over some technology. Again, these are from the Lone Hillside, big, long blades. A lot of people call them arrowheads. Way too large to be on an arrow. You're not going to throw any arrow for that. These are spear points. And so, made out of that molded shirt, very finely made. Then we have these. They're all broken, and they're all broken for a reason. It's because this was from a production site. This is where they were making these things in mass in Meade County, Kentucky. These are called turkey tails, for obvious reasons. But you can see this was broke because there's a impurity there in the shirt or flint. But they were making these in mass production and shipping them out, as I said, all across the country. This turkey tail production, which may be related to some mortuary ritualism too, is something that's very unique to the Falls area. Nobody was making turkey tail points except in the Falls. And the ones that are finished are beautiful. And also, you see that little teeny area right here where they would have put it onto a shaft? There is no way that is a functional artifact. That thing weighs so much, that would have broken that little bit right there if they tried to use it. This is obviously a very ceremonial object. Okay. Again, the Ohio River is full of a lot of hard stone, and this is not found naturally here. We're in a limestone or sedimentary type of area, but this stuff comes from the north, from where they have igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks, But when the glaciers came through and dropped all of these river columns, you can find a lot of this in the Ohio River, in the columns. And so these were used to make axes and a lot of other things. So that was something that they could also get from the rivers. We think about these people as being primitive, but these people had everything they need, and they had plenty of ingenuity and creativity to make what they did not have. These is something called catapults. These are beads. These were found here in Paleo, Ohio, and they were found in the Ohio, the materials down in the Ohio River. I think they have some of these on display at the falls in the Ohio State Park. And so when I'm talking about these people having time to think about things that are artistic and beautiful, they had leisure time. They weren't just scrapping down existence and trying to find out where the next meal's coming from. So this one in particular, these are over at the Clark County Museum, just across the road. These are engraved bone pins that came from deer bone. And these things, we think, have a lot of symbolism that maybe these patterns, which are repeated over and over, and we see some of the same designs in Illinois, that are related to specific families, that they're beautifully done. This is the only piece of bone that I found that has been painted, and there's more bone pins there that are designed. So much of what they might have done in terms of art has been lost, you know. This is from Clark County, Indiana. This is from a water bottle that's broken. But to me, it looks like an owl. It was kind of like an effigy pot. So, I mean, these people were creative. They were artistic. They had very, very rich symbolism that they incorporated into their artifacts. Various types of ceramics found at the Caesars Casino. Their pots. This is a lot. The ceramics tell us a lot about the interaction between groups. So this was found at the Custer site in Portland. It's check stamped. It's the only check stamp pottery we've found in the falls so far. And it shows us that we have an affinity here with people to the south, down in Tennessee. Here, this is down in Clark County, a Mississippian period bowl. Looks like it belongs to the southwest. They're actually there. Again, this one also, this one was amazing. They took a big auger because they had to dig so many holes. They took a big auger and they started digging holes and digging holes. And they came within like that far of that one and did not break it. It was amazing. So this is a special technology called negative painted found at Shippingport. This relates to Angel Mound at Evansville. These are Fort Injun sherds that are found here. Not only are these related to northeast Kentucky, southern Ohio, but the important thing about these is over near the Eve Abandonment Park on River Road, we're finding that Mississippi period people and Fort Injun people who lived at the same time were actually living together in the same village. That was pretty cool for us. Aboriginal territory, much of this area. We also feel like we've got documentation to suggest that the western Kentucky is Chickasaw. Cherokee, of course, down in the southeastern part and down in Tennessee. I mean, in Miami, up into the north. But we also, there's a lot of ambiguity to these things because there were a lot of treaty rights. So at some point, the Cherokee claimed parts of Kentucky, even parts of this area, as treaty rights. The Iroquois had part of this area as treaty rights. But that doesn't mean that that's where their ancestral homes were. But these people throughout that 12,000 years moved around and interacted with people. Are they the same people who were here 8,000 years ago? We don't know. You know, we just, all we know are what we can get from the historical records of who was here when there were some eyewitness accounts. We also had the Delaware that came in. The Delaware were from Pennsylvania, but late in the day, they were relocated forcibly to southern Ohio, and then they moved into the Indiana area. And so the Lenape Delaware are also people that we routinely have to negotiate with, or I should say the federal agencies have to negotiate with, when we're looking at Native American sites in this area, because they do have a 1700s presence here. So how do we know about Native American history? Here, we can look at some of the early maps. We can look at eyewitness accounts. We can listen to the stories and the traditions passed down by the Indians themselves. But we're not finding a lot about late Native American history from archaeology. And there's a reason for that. We have no radiocarbon dates past 1450 in this area. When we take our radiocarbon tests, we have a gap between that and 1729 when we have our first historic eyewitness account of the Indians. what was going on in there. You know, how do we connect the deep past with the tribes that we know about? It's virtually impossible right now. And that is because we don't have any of that contact period sites around here. So the contact period would be at the time when the Indians and the Europeans came together. And so we know that they were here. We know that there's early trade goods on some sites. We know that, that if you read stories, early histories, we know there was contact between these peoples, but we are not finding any sites where we can say, hey, they were here together. And that is really disturbing to us, and we know that they exist. We know that they're present. But the main thing is that we also know that Kentucky was the first state to be settled across the mountains, Appalachian Mountains, and that the Indians fled the state ahead of European incursion into the area. So they went north of the Ohio River into the Northwest Territories or Indiana. I love those maps of Indiana that say uncharted territory. But at any rate, so they went north ahead for various reasons, because of diseases, because of conflict, because of whatever. They went and left as the Europeans were coming in, but there were still attempts over time to reclaim their areas. They would come into that area and hunt. They would come into that area and raid the early settlements, but they really wanted to reclaim their territories. Corn Island, which I mentioned is now underwater, is a place where you can read some of the accounts. They were situated on that island by George Rogers Clark to protect them from the Indians, like the Indians didn't know how to get in the canoe across the water. But, we haven't found anything there. All those early stations that we see along Beargrass Creek, you read those stories, they talk about it was on a daily basis that they encountered the Native Americans. Sometimes there would be 200, groups of 200 coming through. And, and then if you left the confines of the fort, it was at your own risk. As we found out, some of the people out of the Chenoweth family tragedy, I'm kind of trying not to use the word massacre anymore because that's a very charged word. It's very one-sided. Was it a massacre to the Indians? No. It was a massacre to the Europeans. But we know that story there. And here at their park, if you get into the 1858 maps, and again, it's hard for you to read, this is the massacre of the Holt family, and that's where it occurred. And we're still trying to find out who the Holts were. We're having a hard time finding them, but that's on the 1858 map. We also know that here in Clark County, there was a conflict at Pigeon Roost, and Dr. Paul Kramer, one of our members, knows a great deal about that. But also you see that here's Killbuck's Village, a Delaware Indian in 1818, or 1812, I'm sorry. At any rate, we don't know if that's really Killbuck's Village. He was a Lenape, Delaware, because there were 3 different Killbucks, and we know of at least another Killbuck's Village. So nobody's ever excavated there. But we look at these early maps and see what we can find. A lot of what we learn about comes from the wars, the stories of the wars. The Native Americans who were here were constantly being coerced or sought by the different factions in the wars to fight on their side against the other Europeans. And the Native Americans were sometimes pitted against each other as they took separate sides in these conflicts, like the French and Indian Wars and the War of 1812. And so the goal of the Native Americans was to reclaim their territories. But the goal of these Europeans was to, of course, enlarge their forces so that they could beat out their opponents. So we have some accounts like that. And you'll see, as you read in the records, a lot of reference to the northern tribes coming down. And that would be the Huron and the Potawatomi, and those people from up in here, and even the Iroquois, coming down in this area. And that's because they were coming with the armies and with all of the French and English people coming into this area to fight. But you'll see about all of these other people being here. But that doesn't mean that those folks were ever living down here, but they certainly came in and out of the area. So American history is taught us in school, and it's been very slanted towards European colonialism, and we're not learning very much about Native Americans, African Americans, or Asian Americans. It's something that needs to change. There's been some good progress there for African American history, but we're not finding out very much about the Native Americans, and I don't know how much we're going to be able to find. But one of the things we really want to start doing is trying to recognize their role in this area's history and put names to these people and put some faces where we can talk about some of the great leaders that were here. Again, this gentleman is from the Seneca, which is upstate New York, but he also was involved in this area in one of those northern tribes. I can't believe that he would say this, though, that the Ohio mountains were constructed by the white race. I can see the white people saying that, I can't see. So we have like Young Tobacco. He was a Piankashaw chief, and he was out in eastern or western Indiana. He really wanted to be a log hunter. He really wanted to fight with George Rogers Clark. He wanted to be here, and George Rogers and folks convinced him to stay home and take care of his own territory there. But we, you know, it's putting these names to these people that we really, really want to start talking about the great leaders of the Indian tribes that were here. Tecumseh, one of the greatest, a Shawnee chief and warrior, he really promoted resistance to the expansion of the United States. And he was just really known for his ability to speak and to unite the tribes. And, you know, he was really the last great and the best effort to try and get all these tribes who didn't really get along with each other to begin with, to get them to unite, to join together, have a great offensive against the Americans. Pigeon Roost, I mentioned that. This is just up the road in Clark County. It was the site of, quote, another massacre. But we see, I don't have a picture, but that was the name of the one Shawnee chief, Mas Alameda, who came in here and was leading raids into the area. So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done here, but we're trying to see what we can do to learn more about the actual individuals. And at the Fraser Museum, coming up this November, there is going to be a big exhibit called the Commonwealth. They are going to be bringing in some Native Americans. They're going to be, we're giving them some artifacts also to share. And there's going to be a panel and programs, etc., where we're going to be talking about things like this. There's November is Native American Awareness Month, and we're trying really hard to see if we can't recognize that. One last gentleman, just because I was just looking at two examples, Chief Anderson, Indiana. Excuse me, he was a Delaware, and he came in first in Ohio into this area, and he was only part Indian, part, I think it's Swedish. And anyway, he became a very powerful chief there, and Anderson, Indiana is named after him. There are mountains there, there's villages there. So, you know, he's very, there's very good awareness about Chief Anderson up in that area. So, one of the problems, and this is my last slide, so y'all can relax. One of the biggest problems that we have is, we know these sites are here. We just feel like we're going to find one of these contact period sites, but are we going to know what it is when we find it? What's it going to look like? When the Native Americans came into contact with the Europeans, they dropped so much of their own culture right off. They got rid of the stone tools. Metal was better. There are some metal arrowheads been found. But why have arrows when you can have guns? They traded the furs and the skins and other things, and they went in favor of European goods. So gun flints, early European trade goods are something we need to look for. Their houses would not look like what we saw earlier. They would look more like traditional log cabins or some other types of cabins. Their clothing changed, the skins that they wore, those were gone. They went into European clothing. So, you know, what we're trying to say is we might have been on one of these and not recognized it for what it is. It could have been an early European settler or a Native American. So it's really something that we have to start looking for markers. We might find an isolated personal item like a necklace or an heirloom or something like that, but they're going to mostly keep those with them, you know, and not go and discard them at their place. Maybe they lost one. That would be an isolated event, but it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to do this. And in closing, I also want to mention that among the other things that we do, we have the Falls of the Ohio Archaeological Society. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. We're just at Clark County Museum. We do a lot of work with schools and give presentations. And if there's a site that's going to be destroyed, we go in and try to help rescue that if there's no funding for it. It's like all of these people who wanted to be archaeologists and never could for whatever reason. They join us. We have been from farmers who are getting older, don't know what to do with them, want them to be preserved, want them to be saved. We're accepting those collections. We're learning more and more about this from the general public. We invite you all to join us. We do have monthly speakers, and that's on Zoom. And anybody who does have anything or any knowledge to share with us about Native Americans or their artifacts, we can come to FOAS and we'll try our very best to help you out with that and learn from what you've got. A lot of different languages.
Groups, language, takes leisure and educated people, and, the frontiersmen were rough, the settlers were rough.
And it's a thing that we have need to change our thinking about. You think a lot of people like to characterize Native American culture, as an entity, that they all think alike, they all acted alike, they all did the same thing alike, when again, it's an amalgamation of a lot of different cultures and a lot of different beliefs and a lot of different spirituality and a lot of different languages. And so sometimes, you can see it in their mortuary practices, so when I was working at the Corps of Engineers, when we needed to deal with human remains that were found, the responses are just tremendously different, because it reflects their own different ideologies about death and religion. And so, you can't always just assume, hey, the Indians are going to say this. No, the Cherokee might say this, but the Shawnee are going to say that. And other people, it's different. Yes, but that's a very, very good point.
Broad brush, did I hear you say that in that contact period, there is significantly less evidence of what I would call permanent settlement in the falls area?
There is. Now, we do have some in northeastern Kentucky on the Ohio border at Shawneetown. We think that that is one place that we have very, very good evidence that the Fort Ancient peoples were ancestral to the Shawnee Indians. We've got some continuity there. It's not 100%, but yes, so we do have that. And we did, when Daniel Boone came through and he did see evidence of permanent villages, he saw that there were cornfields that had been there the year before and the remains of little huts and stuff like that. So we know that they extended in some parts of Kentucky into that long period of time. We don't have that here that we know about. That doesn't mean it wasn't here. It means Louisville expanded very fast, destroyed a lot of stuff. We've lost a lot. Yeah.
So that contact period when the native people and the Europeans met together, what about contact sites like up in New York or up in the more traditional areas? Are they founding sites that provide that? And
Yeah,
so
they do.
what did they find that made them, that they?
Well, a lot of those were never abandoned, and so Mohawk especially, and those people still have tribal lands up there. They still have federally recognized. The Native Americans still own their properties, and they weren't developed, and they weren't destroyed, and the people never left, and they're still there. So we've got that continuity. Well, we have no federally recognized tribal lands in Kentucky or Indiana. Miami has been trying to get federal recognition because there's a lot of benefits to that for some years. But we do have federally recognized Miami, but they are in Oklahoma. They were relocated. The Miami that are left here now have been trying to get it, but they cannot get past state recognition as a group because they have to be able to show that they've continued some continuity of their customs and their practices and their lifeways over time, and they haven't been able to do that. So they're still fighting for that. But we don't have that here. But yes, in other areas, they certainly do have some of that, but not in here.
Now, in this area that we're talking about, did all the Indians here move themselves to other areas, or did the U.S. government or peoples force them out?
Well, a lot of them left on their own, but it was because of people coming in and they were trying to avoid them. However, let's see, I'm trying to think of any forced removals. I know that the Delaware were forcibly removed. They had their own Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears of the Cherokee did go through parts of Kentucky. So if you go down by Monroe in Kentucky, Monroe County, you'll see down by Hopkinsville, you'll see part of the Trail of Tears where the Cherokee were forcibly removed. So part of that is down there, but I can't think of any tribes, any Shawnee removal. Chickasaw, I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah.
I saw you did excavation on Shippingport Island. Has that one pretty well been researched?
Yeah, well, and that's amazing because we were there 3 years, pretty much, and about that much, $3 million worth of money. I mean, these things are expensive, it's just time consuming. But that was an accidental find. So when they were going to extend the lock, the 600-foot lock to 1,200 foot, they had to dig a big hole out of Shippingport because when they dredged all that water, all that ground out, it was very wet. They needed a hole to put that in so the water would drain off so that they could, then use it somewhere else. So when they dug this 100 square foot hole, they thought it was disturbed already because there was so much fill and junk and everything there. They got down to about 16, 17 feet, and all of a sudden, all this Native American stuff is underneath all this historic fill. And so we were confined to a little area around that hole, and that's where we found the 17 houses. But if we moved further away from that little area that we were allowed, we would find more. There's a lot more on Shippingport than we know about.
There's one other thing about, I have some land in that area, and I'd like to build because it overlooks Shippingport Island, the canal, and it's in Portland, so there's different reasons for doing it at certain times. But there's also the power plant that just got torn down there at 22nd Street and Northwestern Parkway. It's right, it used to be right, well, they just finished a few weeks ago. It's completely demolished now. And
That's
I was able to get inside, and inside there was a massive hole, concrete walls, and it went probably 50 or 60 feet deep. Now, I'm not sure how that was related to the plant, but when that was dug out, I believe they just filled it in with dirt, best I can
And
tell.
you gotta remember too, that the Ohio River is 25 feet higher now than it was. When they put that dam in there, they raised that water level. So a lot of area that was exposed at one time is now under the water. So we've lost some things that were on the shoreline. But Portland and 22nd Avenue is a very important area for us, and it's very exciting because you think when you go into an area that's a neighborhood and that is built, that everything's destroyed, you're not gonna find anything. But at the end of 22nd, our Northwestern Parkway there, the railroad track, there's that little big white house with the green trim. It's a private yard, so I don't encourage anybody to go over there and walk at it or walk in there or anything like that. An elderly couple lives there, and they're very, very nice. I wouldn't want to bother them. But they invited us to explore their yard because they have about an acre. Out of the blue, we started finding so much Native American stuff on that property. Houses, Native American houses, pottery. We found mica that comes from the Appalachian Mountains there. And the reason that it's interesting to us is that that area was not flooded in 1937. It was on a landform that was a little bit higher. So when we dug down there, it was close to the surface. It wasn't buried under alluvium from the rivers of the floods. It wasn't buried under fill that was from demolishing of Louisville. It was right there. And so, I left a little early one day, and my people called me and they said, hey, we got 77 potsherds in this little hole. And I said, go away, it's probably historic. And they, no. So I turned around and went back, and sure enough, they had the most amazing stuff found at that site. We call it the Custer site, and it is something that we're writing about right now.
Sorry, this street was called High Street
Yeah.
at the time, so it's
Yeah,
now
there's a reason for
Northwestern
that.
Parkway.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And everything's, there's no buildings between me and the river now.
And it's just amazing to me that close to the river and it wasn't flooded during 37.
Were you involved personally in the mound south end of the airport?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So in 72, it was one of my very first, I was there when they discovered it. And it was I was a baby. And it was one of my very first excavations. And everybody still says that I will never find anything to compare with digging at what we call the Keeang site, the Kentucky Air National Guard site. And it is still there. It is preserved between two runways. But we dates very tightly to 5,200 years ago, and a lot of burials, and it should be preserved and not disturbed. But it was, it's interesting in so many ways, but it is something that, really has driven UPS nuts because they have to keep this little enclave and they have to walk around it because nobody wants to remove those burials and to disturb them, and yet it's really in their way.
Is that the one that you see aerial-wise, that you look down and
And you
it's
see
concrete?
that little green patch?
Correct.
Green spot.
Yeah, we found that in 72. They called it out. And then we had We had a Chippewa chief come down, and we had FBI men in the weeds, and we were, a contingent of Native Americans came down with this chief, and he was blessing the ground and consecrating it. But we were afraid of protesters. There were a lot of protests at that point in time, especially on the University of Louisville campus. And so they were there to kind of protect us, the three of us. It was an interesting exchange, an interesting cultural exchange. But yeah, I love that site.
You think, the drainage has all changed, you think the bodies in there are still preserved?
They are.
But I was just wondering with the change in chemistry as well, everything.
No, they're fine. They're quite fine. They don't get wet, I mean, rain, but they don't. And the reason that they're so well preserved is because that's one of those shell midget sites. When you have all that muscle, it's full of calcium. So when it deteriorates over time, it does the same thing as drinking milk to our bones. It preserves those bones. Those bones are strong and they're hard and they're well taken care of because of all of that calcium from the muscle cell.
Were there artifacts from the south end of the airport preserved, and where are they?
They're in various places. I have a great number of them myself. When Dr. Donald Jansen retired and went to California, he came to me and he said, well, these artifacts do not belong in California, and he gave them to me. And so some of them are now in, and I was going to mention this to you, there's a Native American display in the Jeffersontown Museum. It'll be up there for the end of the year. You all should go see it. A lot of the artifacts are there. We've given some to the Fraser right now for a year for them to use, but we're still studying them ourselves. Other people have them in private collections. There are a few at the University of Louisville. But yeah, I think the ones that came from the UPS site, the International Park came in and did an inventory of those because of all the burials. Those have gone to the University of Kentucky.
I just want to say thank you for all that you've done to add to the record over your career.
Well,
It's amazing. And
It was
it's-
like I woke up one day in the 6th grade and I said, I'm going to do this. Then you go to this little Catholic school with all these nuns and they say, you're a woman, first of all, women don't do this. I'm like, oh boy. And then they say, you're a shy, introverted little person and you got to go out and you've got to find grants. You go have it in you. And then they're trying to, get you into like, secondary school and all that kind of stuff. The more that you're not going to do this, but yeah.
Speaking of grants, so it seems to me like a lot of the larger digs are funded by like federal efforts. Do you see anything coming down the pike with the American Rescue Plan or anything like that?
So, what's in kind of in a roundabout way, what's going on is we don't go out. Academic people still go out and get grants for their own personal research, through the National Geographic, et cetera, whatever. But in 1966, they passed the National Historic Preservation Act. It's part of that whole environmental movement associated with NEPA and everything, and awareness that once these sites are gone, they're destroyed. They're a non-renewable resource. You can't get these Indians to come back and live again. And so laws were enacted. So there are 3 conditions. If there are any federal funds involved, if it's on federal property, or if you have to have a federal permit, you have to have an archaeologist out there ahead of time. And that's what's keeping my business going and what has kept it going. Right now, you cannot build a bank without having an archaeologist out there before. No cell towers, no highways, no reservoir modifications. The list is endless. There's just so many things that you have to have, and archaeology has to be done. And so that's Rescue Act. We are getting a lot more influx into infrastructure, and so we're getting a lot more into bridges and into highway reconstruction. And so, yes, we have been extreme all throughout COVID. I've never been so busy with my own business as we have during COVID. We are just overwhelmed.